In this interactive video, we're going to dig a little deeper into Hinduism by taking a look at what the four great aims or purposes or goals in life are for Hindus, um, and the paths of desire and renunciation, which comprise those four great aims or goals. Um, we're going to look at how to reach the beyond within, according to Hinduism, and then also the four paths to the goals of moksha or liberation, which are essentially the yogas. So for in Hinduism, there are four great aims of life, and they are split into two different paths. There's the path of desire and the path of renunciation. So the path of desire is comprised of pleasure and success, and the path of renunciation is comprised of duty and liberation. So let's unpack all of these. So first, path of desire, pleasure and success. So we'll take a look at pleasure. Pretty easy to understand, right? Pleasure seeking is the first of the four legitimate aims of life. You know, we're wired to seek pleasure, and it's natural. We pursue pleasure, we avoid pain. However, for many people, pleasure seeking as the dominant mode of existence becomes unsatisfactory, or if not just flat out boring. Like you reach critical mass of pleasure, is the idea. And this idea is echoed in many other philosophies, including ancient Greek, with the hedonistic paradox of Epicurus, who basically sums it up by saying one of the most ineffective ways to achieve pleasure is to deliberately seek it out. So keep in mind, though, pleasure seeking is legitimate. It's not sinful in Hinduism. It's a legitimate aim of life. It simply has its limits. And success, the other prong of the path of desire, and that essentially means wealth, fame, power. So again, this is not like sinful or contemptible as such. There's nothing wrong with earthly success in Hinduism. It's the second of the four legitimate aims of life. However, this pursuit, the pursuit of success, harbors a bunch of limitations as well. First, it's exclusive, and that makes it competitive, and that makes it precarious, right? Success in terms of wealth, fame, and power is effectively a zero-sum game. It's insatiable. When wealth, fame, and power are someone's chief ambition, people are never satisfied. You never have enough. And you can look to, there's all sorts of people that you can look to demonstrate this. When is enough enough? Well, for people who are pursuing wealth for wealth's sake, or fame for fame's sake, or power for power's sake, it seems to never be enough. You can never be wealthy enough, never be famous enough, never be powerful enough. So it's insatiable, argues Hinduism. Also, it's self-centered, and it centers all meaning of life and existence in the self, which proves to be too small to contain it. The idea here is that your individual selves, or my individual self, if this is all I can find meaning in, I'm trying to put an infinite amount of everything into a container that is way too small to contain it. I'm trying to pour an ocean into an eggshell, right? And also it's ephemeral. wealth, fame, and power don't survive bodily death. These pursuits are confined to, biological life. And once your body's dead, they're gone. So these are the limitations that Hinduism describes uh, in terms of the pursuit of success. But then we're on to the path of renunciation. That's comprised of duty and liberation. So we'll unpack those as well. So duty marks the first great step in religion, and it's the third of the four legitimate aims of life. And the self-worship that's involved with the path of desire that we just discussed, when it shows itself to being too limited, we tend to start looking for something greater than ourselves, right? So when we've hit the hedonistic paradox in pleasure seeking and see that there's just no end to it, and the same with success and wealth and power and fame, that it's insatiable, when we reach the point and discover that how limited the path of desire is, we start to, or have a tendency to start to look for something greater than ourselves. And that's duty, right? Being of service to others reveals itself as a good candidate for something greater than ourselves. However, says Hinduism, even these rewards prove insufficient due to their temporal nature. What temporal nature means, because they're time based, right? And they're temporary, right? They're not infinite. They don't have duty to others. Does not show itself to be something that attaches you to the infinite. It still is situated in time and in everyday life. So Hinduism says the final human good must lie somewhere else, although this was a good step away from pleasure and success, which once again are legitimate aims of life for Hinduism. They're not sins. But Hinduism says basically you can do better. Then we get to the other prong in the path of renunciation, which is liberation. And according to the Houston textbook, that's what people really want, right? We want being, just to be here, metaphysical, real being. We want it, but we want it infinitely. Right? We want knowledge, but we want it infinitely. We want joy, but we want it infinitely. So in other words, we want liberation from finitude. We want liberation from mortality, from time-based, time-constrained being. We want to get out of this world of things that end and go away. We want liberation from finitude. And Hinduism argues that this is reflected in our distinctly human capacity to think of something without limits, the infinite. So the idea here is this: the fact that we can even contemplate the infinite is kind of like a cipher. It's kind of like a clue to what we really want. You can imagine, I doubt that your dog sits around contemplating the infinite. Like, what is infinity? And how can anything actually not have an end? And I seriously doubt that. Or dolphins, or apes for that matter, right? It's a human capacity to just sit around and contemplate something without limits. So this, says Hinduism, is a clue to what we really want. We want liberation from finitude. And further, it's because at the core of our being, there is a hidden self, or Atman, which itself is a reflection of Brahman, or ultimate and infinite reality that's underlying all sensible phenomena. So the claim here, and again, it's a metaphysical claim, that we've got a hidden self, we've got kind of a fake self in each of us, but there's this hidden self that the Hindus referred to as Atman, which is a reflection of ultimate reality and an aspect, or like a clearing through which ultimate reality kind of shines, is this real self, this real Atman, underneath all of the coverings and all of the things we cling to in the earthly life. So, to sum up, according to Hinduism, what we really want is liberation from the finite world and finite being, and finite knowledge, and finite joy. So this section is about how the Hindus think you can reach the beyond, right? Beyond finitude, effectively, within your finite self. Hence the beyond within. So this is Oliver Wendell Holmes, who made the claim, and it's a pretty famous claim, that the aim of life is to get as far as possible from imperfection. That's the goal. That's the purpose of life, said Oliver Wendell Holmes. Well, Hinduism says that the purpose of life is to pass beyond imperfection altogether, not just get as far as possible from it. So to do so, we have to first recognize the obstacles that get in the way. Right? What are the strictures on our joy? What are the strictures means what are impediments, or 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 what's holding us back from optimal or infinite joy? What's holding us back? What are the strictures on our knowledge, or ultimate knowledge, or infinite knowledge? What's holding us back? What's holding us back on our being? Right? Those are the strictures, the things that confine joy, knowledge, and being. What are they? Well, says Hinduism, strictures on our joy include physical pain. The conquest of fear can help with physical pain. And also notice how physical pain can be tolerated under certain circumstances, like medical need or urgent purpose, for instance, right? We can get beyond certain levels of physical pain, and some people make it a goal in their life to transcend physical pain. So physical pain is something that holds us back from joy, right? It's a stricture on joy. Psychological pain holds us back from joy and is a stricture on joy. It's psychological pain from frustrated desires, right? Like these involve unfulfilled expectations of your individual ego, when you really want something and think you deserve it and don't get it, and you are psychologically disturbed as a result. That puts a hindrance or a stricture on your joy, right? So Hinduism says, what if your ego just had no expectations? Couldn't we remove your psychological pain by removing these sorts of expectations that cause it in the first instance? And boredom. Boredom's a stricture on our joy, says Hinduism. And boredom occurs when we're too attached to the finite or mortal self. What if we could cultivate an identification with the infinite self instead? Asks Hinduism. Then, so here's the idea. If it's physical pain, psychological pain, and boredom that get in the way of optimizing our joy, that serve as strictures on our joy, here are some possible solutions. Physical pain can be overcome with practice and discipline in many cases. Psychological pain can be overcome if we were to adjust the ego. And boredom can be overcome if we stop identifying with our temporal, everyday, quote unquote, self or identity and cultivate and grow some sort of identification with our Atman or our infinite self instead. Then we've got strictures or limitations on our knowledge. So it's basically ignorance. That's the problem, right? Remember, we want infinite joy. Well, the last slide was discussing why we can't achieve infinite joy because of these reasons. We've got to come to grips with it in order to overcome it, right? Well, we also want infinite knowledge. Well, this is why we can't have it. There are strictures on our knowledge that we get stuck in, right? Basically, it's ignorance. And Hinduism says this can be overcome by pursuing transcendent knowledge, or knowledge of that which brings knowledge of everything. In other words, knowledge of first principles. What this is what philosophy seeks to do, right? Knowledge of first principles. What is there and how can we know? And the idea is once you can understand first principles, be they whatever they are, everything else kind of flows from that, right? It's an insight that reveals the point of everything, such as that the details don't really matter, right? You can kind of see through the matrix, if you will, right? You see that it's all a bunch of code, to use the matrix analogy. That would be the first principles. If you've seen the matrix, sorry if you haven't, but if you haven't, you should. Okay, even academic psychology recognizes that there's much more to our mental capacities than may meet the eye, right? For instance, we only use X% of our brains. I know some people say 10%. This is a number that's in dispute. However, the argument is, and a lot of the evidence says, look, we could do a lot more with our brains than we really do. Let's put it that way. And that the mind, the conscious mind, is like an iceberg, where the tip of the iceberg, you may see just the tip of the iceberg, but the iceberg is all, is gigantic underneath that little piece that you see, right? So our consciousness, or what we're aware of, is tiny compared to what is actually going on in our brain. To keep this in mind, right? And Carl Jung, if you're familiar with this very famous, he was a disciple of Sigmund Freud and one of the founders of psychology, said the mind actually contains racial memories that summarize the experience of the history of humanity. That's not something we're conscious of on a daily basis, if it's even true to begin with. The point is that the brain is capable of a lot more and holds a lot more than our conscious awareness our everyday conscious awareness can ever come into contact with, or often does come into contact with. But there are ways to cultivate greater awareness, and there's ways to expand awareness, and there's ways to coax more of the iceberg out and be conscious and of more. And one of the ways you can become conscious of more, or one of the most important ways you become conscious of more, is by recognizing how much it is that you're effectively ignorant of. That should remind some of you about of Socrates, for instance, from philosophy, that the main thing I know is that I know nothing. And that's his starting point, is accepting ignorance. So ignorance is a stricture on our knowledge, and it can be overcome by pursuing what Hindus call transcendent knowledge. And then finally, there's strictures on our being. right? So in order to start understanding what these limitations on our being are, considering that the idea is we want infinite being, we have to consider how the boundary of the self is defined. So first, we don't define ourselves simply by the amount of space we take up. We don't just say, who are you? I am something that takes up space. That's not the way we define ourselves. So even if we could instead define and identify ourselves with the whole of being, if we manage to do that, like infinity, it would still be the case that we're going to die. Our bodies, our biological selves are mortal and will um, corrupt and die, correct? So instead, we should look to our temporal or time-based or mortal finite existence and experience for a clue. So here's the clue, says Hinduism. Strictly speaking, every moment of our lives is a little dying, right? So you right now, boom, are not identical to what you were just a moment ago. You're not identical physically or mentally. Right? Your cells have changed from a moment ago. Just listening to other words and experiencing something unfolding in time has changed you mentally. You are at every moment. The past you is dead, physically and mentally. Boom, that this is a new way or a different way of looking at your quote unquote self. So the you that you think you are will be, in a sense, dead in another moment. So that me that was just saying these words is dead physically and mentally because there's a new me physically and mentally right now, strictly speaking. Right? If to be identical means to have all the same properties, and if I am constantly in a state of flux and changing cellularly and mentally, then I am not identical to myself that said those words just a moment ago. So that me is dead, and now there's a new me. Now that one's dead too. It's a trip, right? So, but we don't usually think of ourselves this way in everyday life. It's difficult, and we don't equate ourselves with our individual moments. We endure through them and experience them without being identical to them. But Hinduism says, and like I hinted at up here, like my dead self hinted at up here, what if this notion can be extended to include our whole lifespan? I mean, in other words, what if you could incorporate this idea of constant change? And I mean, really, as at a heavy a level as you are capable of cultivating it, what would happen then? Would some of the strictures on our being be removed? How could your lives change if you looked at every single moment as effectively a new identity? You know, what could start revealing itself to you is that our identities are often uh, constructed through our memories and things that we cling to from the past. Right? I am a this, I am a that. I am this political party. I am this sexuality. I am this type of person. I have this type of career. And every moment effectively is an opportunity to be something else unless you choose to continue to cling to identities and psychological connections from the past. Right? So that's roughly the idea. Now we'll talk about the four paths to the goal of moksha or liberation, and those are the yogas. Yoga is um, very well known to most of us, right? As an exercise, right? So some people are chiefly interested in their bodies and they practice hatha yoga often. And that's not our concern here. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about these four. Jnana, Bhakti, Karma, and Raja yogas. And Hinduism says you got to figure out what your personality type is, and then you'll know which yoga to practice. So some people are primarily reflective, and for them there is jnana yoga. Some people are primarily emotional, and for them there is bhakti yoga. Some people are primarily active, and for them there's karma yoga. And some people are primarily experimental, and for them there's Raja yoga. So all four, remember, we're not paying attention to this. Not that there's anything wrong with Hatha yoga, but we're talking about these four. All four of these begin with moral preliminaries, though, because, says Hinduism, the self must be cleansed of impurities in order to render the surface self, or your fake self, transparent, so that you can see your fake self or surface self first. So the first step of every yoga involves the cultivation of habits like non-injury, truthfulness, non-stealing, self-control, cleanliness, contentment, self-discipline, and also a compelling desire to reach the goal, which is moksha, or liberation. So we'll take each of these in turn. So the way to God, or moksha, or liberation, through knowledge. That's one of them, which is jnana yoga. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And that's intended for spiritual aspirants who have a strong reflective bent, people with this personality type. So it has nothing to, so knowledge here has nothing to do with factual information. It's not encyclopedic. It's like the way, it's not like go study encyclopedias and Wikipedia and learn every fact about the world, and that's what you got to do. That's not what they're talking about here. It is rather an internal discernment that transforms you. So discrimination between the eternal and the non-eternal is a prerequisite, or a part of jnana yoga. So Hinduism says this is the shortest but steepest path to moksha, or liberation. Right? Shortest but steepest. Hardest but shortest. There's the way to God, or moksha, or liberation through love, which is bhakti yoga. And so that's for people whose personalities are primarily emotional. And that involves loving God dearly, only, and non-instrumentally. Non-instrumentally meaning that you're not just saying, please God, give me this, that, or the other, or make this happen, or make this not happen. It's not as a means to an end. Every strengthening of our love of God is a weakening of the world's grip. So you're practicing this type of non-instrumental, absolute love of God in Bhakti yoga. It involves Japam, which is repeating God's name. It involves celebrating the different forms of love. Love assumes different forms according to the relationship involved, kind of like the different types of love that the Greeks recognized. It also involves, Bhakti yoga also involves worshiping one's chosen ideal, or like role model, right? You choose your ishta, or representation of God. And the reason that there's so many is because Brahman's possibilities are infinite. So this goes back to when we discussed the principal gods in a previous module. And if you've studied any bit of Hinduism before, you probably know how many different gods, demigods, or avatars and ishtas there are. They're uncountable, right? Well, one of the reasons for this is because Brahmins, or infinite realities. Possibilities are, by definition, infinite, so they're pretty much infinite representations or ishta of gods. Your job in bhakti yoga, if your personality is inclined toward bhakti yoga, is to choose your ishta and worship that one, because by doing so, you begin to cultivate the features and qualities of that particular ishta, and you've got infinite to choose from. Then there's the way to God or moksha or liberation through work, which is karma yoga. So this is for those more inclined to action in the world, right? You don't have to retreat to the forest to realize God or moksha or liberation. You can find God in the world of everyday affairs and getting involved in everyday affairs, something that what people would today call, social justice activism, for instance. So this is work performed in detachment from the empirical everyday self. It's not work performed for the sake of money or praise, right? That kind of stuff inflates rather than diminishes the ego. It's work that is performed on behalf of others and to uplift others and create better circumstances for others. This was Gandhi's preferred yoga. And then finally, there's the way to God through psychophysical exercises, and that is Raja Yoga. The royal Raj road to reintegration. So this was supposed to be for basically the road for royalty, right? Designed for people who are experimentally inclined, who like to test the waters, who like to experiment with life and make choices sometimes that don't seem the most prudent or don't seem the safest because they're trying to figure things out on their own. That's what's meant by experimentally inclined. So they're effectively mental experiments, also designed to confirm or negate hypotheses about being and living. So the principal hypothesis is that the self, quote unquote, is not threefold, like bodies, consciousness, and subconsciousness, but rather fourfold. And the method here is willed introversion. I know this seems a little bit confusing. It's probably the most philosophical uh, yoga, right? Willed introversion in order to unpack what's behind everything that you are thinking. It's like a mental archaeology, and you got to be a little bit fearless, um, one would say, for Raja yoga, because it can be dangerous essentially, both psychologically and physically, because of its experimental nature. Okay, so in this video, we covered what Hinduism describes as the four great aims in life, which are desire, which are comprised of the path of desire and renunciation, and are pleasure, success, duty, and liberation. Those are the great four aims. We talked about reaching the beyond within, reaching the infinite in a finite situation, and also the four paths to the goal of moksha or liberation, which are the yogas.